and I think that we can begin. I would ask that if you are not speaking, to please mute your phone or your speaker, and there's a little button down at the left-hand corner to mute it, and then to unmute, you can easily do that. I am Bob Blum, and together with my colleague Leah Koenig, we'll be facilitating this webinar. The webinar is really intended to be a dialogue. We have a few questions at the end to raise, but what we really want to be able to do is to hear from you, ideas, issues, concerns, experiences, perspectives that relate to ethical issues in both doing research and programming for young people who live in low-income and vulnerable environments. The way that we're going to structure the conversation is that first Leah will share the work that she has been leading on the review of the literature and some of the key points that are being found. Secondly, I'll review some of the preliminary findings that we have done from a global survey of those who work with young adolescents, and then we're going to go into the discussion. So I'm going to mute my phone, my speaker, and turn it over to Leah.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Great. I'm very happy to be joining you today to present some preliminary results from a review our team at the Global Early Adolescent Study is conducting on ethical issues in working with vulnerable adolescents. To give you a brief overview of our methodology, our search was conducted using PubMed in February of this year. We included papers written in English, 1995 or later. Our search terms are listed here, aiming to restrict the age group to adolescent minors to focus particularly on vulnerable groups of adolescents, to limit those results to those pertaining to participants in research or programming, and finally, that addressed ethics or ethical issues. Our initial search resulted in 1,334 articles, and through abstract, title, and full text screening, were eventually narrowed to 35 papers. These 35 papers addressed issues pertaining to ethical issues with adolescents with a range of vulnerabilities, including incarcerated, pregnant, displaced adolescents, and other groups. I'll note here that our review of peer-reviewed literature specifically pertained primarily to research, unsurprisingly, with young adolescents and underrepresented literature pertaining to adolescent programming. So our review of the included papers has resulted in a number of themes, several of which I will review here quite briefly. Following the ethics principle of justice, the first theme we identified is a recurring message throughout this group of articles that vulnerable adolescents should have the opportunity to be included in research, and that the challenges that arise in reaching them does not justify their exclusion. A number of the articles also highlighted the potential benefits of research participation for these groups of vulnerable adolescents. The second issue that arose in many of the articles was issues in consent and assent. And though laws vary, many studies enrolling adolescents, including the Global Early Adolescent Study, obtain both parental consent and adolescent assent as prerequisites for participation in the study. However, several authors in our review highlighted the complications that can arise in assenting vulnerable adolescents in particular. The first pertained to groups of vulnerable adolescents for whom a parent or guardian was absent, such as homeless or orphaned adolescents. The absence of a parent or guardian's consent was addressed in several of the studies by issuance of a consent waiver, or in the case of Embleton et al.'s 2015 study of street-connected children in Kenya, a responsible community agency provided consent for adolescents' participation for those who were no longer connected to a parent or guardian. A second issue that arose in the reviewed literature was assuring that vulnerable adolescents' assent was truly voluntary and informed. Identified studies, including Davis et al., have administered quizzes during the process of administering assent, finding that adolescents who use drugs within a US context scored highly on a quiz assessing their understanding of key elements of the informed assent form. This indicated good comprehension of the terms of assent among a vulnerable adolescent population and could be a promising intervention to assure the voluntary nature of assent in research enrolling adolescents. Finally, some of the literature we reviewed identified potential issues of coercion that may arise from a power differential between the person assenting the adolescent into the study and the adolescent themselves. Several studies have made concerted efforts to address this power differential, such as having a social worker who specialized in work with vulnerable adolescent populations administer the assent, or in the case of Nakash et al.'s study of Palestinian refugee youth, to train other youth to administer the consent or assent. Bear with me one moment. It seems as though my screen is frozen, so I'm just going to play the slides for one moment. Quinn, are you able to share?
Yes, I can share.
Okay, sorry everyone for the technical difficulties. Oh, it seems that my computer, I think I can do it actually. Okay, I think we're back on track. Okay, the next topic we identified in our review were issues of confidentiality. Primarily, the tension identified in confidentiality was ensuring participants' anonymity in research while also communicating the limits of confidentiality. If researchers become concerned that the participant is at risk of harm by themselves or others. So here, Willett et al. Described how they handled this tension in their study, stating consent procedures disclose that confidentiality may be broken by the mandatory reporting requirements related to suspected ill treatment, abuse, or neglect of children. On a very related note, another issue identified in our literature review was that when participants did disclose reports of harm by themselves or others, the included papers documented challenges wherein existing reporting or referral structures to respond to this harm were underdeveloped. Embleton et al. Suggest embedding research into existing programs and response systems. However, other authors highlighted the dilemma of responding to participant distress or harm where services to provide support were inadequate. And this is something that we saw that Bob will present in the survey results later as well. Finally, a few of the other topics we identified in our review so far were adolescents' expectations of the benefits they would receive from participating in research and some discordance between participants' understanding and what the realities of the study benefits actually were. And finally, determining fair remuneration for participation for vulnerable adolescent populations who may be at heightened risk for coercion. So this was a very brief overview of the work our team is conducting to review the literature on ethical issues that arise in working with vulnerable adolescent populations. Next steps will include additional synthesis of our selected material thus far, an expansion of our review of the literature to additional search engines, and very importantly, we wanted to highlight that part of our next steps moving forward in this project will be to conduct a gray literature search, which will specifically help to better represent IRB and programmatic recommendations, as well as guidelines in our review. So thank you everyone for your attention. I will be turning the mic over to Bob now. And Bob, you should have control of the screen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leah. Before going into the findings from the survey that we did, worth mentioning that what really compelled this work for us at the Global Early Adolescence Study was that during our first phase of work, our developmental phase in 15 different cities in 15 countries around the world, what we were seeing was that there were numerous ethical issues that were arising of a wide variety, and that the IRB's guidance at times were helpful, but in truth, there were gradations and issues that were not easily resolved. And we wanted to find out to what extent the issues that we were seeing were being seen universally. What we undertook was a study then that we sent out to our entire network through the Global Early Adolescence Study and asked them to send it out much further. So for example, it went to all folks working at Save the Children with in low and middle income countries, with young adolescents, with Pop Council, etc. So this was a self-administered anonymous questionnaire that was done online. We asked 11 questions, some of which just collected demographic information, where they worked, did they work with young adolescents, etc. And for those who did, whether they had experienced ethical issues and concerns, whether they sought guidance, what guidance they got if they sought it, and how useful it was, and what they would see as being helpful going forward. So it was predominantly an open-ended questionnaire. We received 184 responses, which clearly indicate that this is an issue or a set of issues that are important to people. We wound up with a usable sample of 119, and of those, 2/3 indicated that they did face one or more ethical dilemmas when working with young adolescents. Here we're going to be looking at the preliminary results from that survey, and what those who work both in research and in service and programming, are telling us that were important. A lot of what we were hearing and seeing is consistent with what Leah was talking about emerging from the literature. Issues of consent were extremely important. Harmful practices and exposures and how to deal with them was a second set of issues. Confidentiality, a third. And some of the tensions between research and child safeguarding, the fourth. And we'll elaborate on each of these. So, under consent, there's a whole set of complicated issues. In some countries, and in Europe, for example, adolescents at a much younger age consent to doing research. They are seen as competent to give consent, while in, for example, the United States, you have to be over 18 years of age to consent, and under that, you assent. There was a concern raised by a number of people that obtaining parental consent limits adolescents' autonomy rights, the right to participate in studies. That there was also a concern that the requirement for parental consent limits adolescents' participation. It creates stigma. And I'll give some examples around how this plays out. And it also added a lot of logistical complications and for some expense. The need for consent, some said, led to sample bias because those who may be more vulnerable, parents may be less likely to consent. So there's a desirability bias, perhaps, built in to the parental consent process. We were hearing issues around disclosures of harm and how to deal with that as a set of issues or concerns. One example, the most pressing issues were related to information shared with us by adolescents in confidence about ongoing physical, mental, or sexual abuse, ill treatment at home or in school, unsafe neighborhoods, particularly sexual harassment on streets, while describing their stressors. Many a time, these were shared with us specifically after clarifying that parents will not be informed or involved. Let me say that again. It's important. Many times they were shared with us specifically after the young person received assurance that parents would not be informed or involved. Being young adolescents, it was difficult to address these issues ethically without involving parents or guardians. So there's sort of a duality. Adolescents share information, but then there's a challenge of being able then to help them. The lack of resources to address identified issues. The legal framework of the country makes it mandatory to report cases of sexual abuse to police. But we're aware of how detrimental the legal system is and the course it takes for the child. Please step back. Thank you. I'll just mention advance. The challenge is there may be legal requirements in settings that mandate reporting, but there aren't the services or programs in place at all that make a difference. So should the question that was raised, should we give the right to decide to the child or to abide by a new law? Should we report the case to police, and the police who are insensitive, and it often ends up harming the child much more than benefiting her or him, or report it to another organization that works with children and that has the capacity to deal with the issue. So here the conflict is between legal mandates and identifying services that benefit young people. Next, please. The schools often feel powerless, don't have the resources or the capacity to deal with issues identified. Again, an example. I discussed sexual harassment issues at schools with the NGO working with these schools without revealing the names. They already knew about the situation and found themselves unable to really address it. They informed the school inspection or the Ministry of Education, and then, without having hard evidence or student testimonies, they just relocated the suspected teachers engaged with the abusive situation to another school. It's a gray area because sometimes students approach teachers for sex too, in the context where transactional sex is part of the meaning system, the understanding that people have. Teacher is seen as a good score, in quotes. So the issue at times can put adults in compromising positions, put adolescents in, and schools don't feel that they have the capacity to really sort this out and don't feel that they have the backstopping and support from higher levels in the Ministry of Education or elsewhere to manage this. Next, please. An additional issue is youth refusal to allow for disclosure. So a young person tells you something, but they do not want this information shared with anyone else. One example is when the child is engaged in self-harm behavior. She doesn't want to report this to a parent, as the parent may withdraw her from the school for disclosing such personal or what is seen as familial issues. Reporting to local authorities might not help much and may in fact bring more shame to the family. So here is an example of a young person engaged in self-harm where help would be clearly beneficial, but she is saying, don't share this information with others. Next, please. Another issue is the tension between what's referred to in IRB principles or ethical principles is the tension between beneficence, protecting children, and autonomy, their rights to make decisions. And here the tension between parent consent requirements and adolescent autonomy is one example. When does the adolescent have the right to engage in research without asking parental permission? But what when there is information that is obtained where parental protection may be really important, but the adolescent doesn't want any action to be taken? How to deal with this? Next, please. Another set of issues that were raised related to IRBs or ethical review board notification. And for those who do research, we know well that IRBs require reporting of information. But only a quarter of respondents, 21, indicated that they had notified their IRB of specific situations facing young people. There's a perception that IRBs are poorly equipped to deal with research with young adolescents. Some IRBs are working to address these issues, but people indicated there's a big need, and often IRBs are not seen as a source of guidance. They're more seen as policing and monitoring. Next, please. What we were hearing is that most people who both do research and programming with young people in vulnerable environments want guidance. They want guidance dealing, for example, between the tension of confidentiality and safeguarding. Participants outlined the need to highlight the ethical concerns that come with doing research with very young adolescents, in particular, these tensions. Other participants also highlighted the need to address the weak child protection systems. And this is something we certainly have seen in the GEAS, and that has caused a lot of issue and concern in settings where there are simply not the human resources to be able to respond to issues. How do you deal with protecting young people, their confidentiality, and trying to help them and concurrently abide by the law? And these are some of the challenges. Next, please. Other areas that people said were needed: guidelines on how to make moral judgments. There were requests for global guidelines from UN, the World Health Organization, or other international entities. Case examples of how issues were addressed and resolved. And here, perhaps to have a forum that allows for this kind of discussion. A second area was the development of a community of practice where trusted and experienced colleagues could troubleshoot and where issues could be raised in an anonymous and confidential kind of way. People spoke of the need to have psychologists or mental health workers be available to the researchers and practitioners, because not uncommonly, there are frustrations that are experienced where we really face the limits of what we can do to protect young people. And again, this is something we've seen very recently in one of our sites, where it's one thing to report unusually high mortality rate that occurred and to comply with all of the requirements, but concurrently you're faced with the limits of what one can reasonably do. And they're embedded in this are a lot of frustrations and tensions. The third was the suggestion for an online platform or a repository of information of what can be done in specific situations. So this links back to the suggestion of guidelines or having frequently asked questions in response. lists of organizations that can provide and be good resources, and resources that relate to the legal requirements for young adolescents in various countries, where ideas, all of these were ideas generated. Next, please. So I'd like to acknowledge those who were very involved. Asta Ramaya assisted with the data analysis. This work is supported by the Oak and Gates Foundations. There was an ethical working group whose names are noted here, who were involved with helping to shape the survey. I have a set of discussion questions that we'll go to momentarily. This work and the conversation we're having today will lead in at the end of April, early May, into a workshop at the World Health Organization in Geneva, where these issues that have been raised both in the literature, in the survey, and in today's conversation will be worked through, and then a plan for addressing them over the next 12 to 24 months, and setting up a system to help support those who do programming, services, and research would be put in place. Let's turn next, please, to the questions that we have. Not seeing them. What I would like to do is to open this up for broader discussion. And one of the questions that I have, and I'm going to ask Leah if you can moderate this, because I don't have access to controlling the screen at all. And you can see people's responses. The first question I have is, from your perspectives, as a researcher or as a person doing programming, what are the most important issues that you see? Could you elaborate on thank you. What guidance and resources do you believe to be most valuable for researchers and programmers? Next slide, please. And this can be online support or human supports or other resources. If you please feel free to talk. We'd really like to hear, but if you're not talking, please turn off your mic. When you say the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what is it that you're specifically saying regarding the rights of adolescents to participate in research, and how should this be negotiated or dealt with? And I would just want to reiterate that here, the 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 intent here is really to have a conversation with those who are online about the issues and the approaches that you think will be most valuable in your work and in helping your work. We're coming up against a new IRB requirement for specific reimbursement remuneration to research participants. This could lead to participation to gain a benefit and could be seen as coercive. Has this come up as an issue in the literature? Let me give you one example from our experience and then turn it to Leah to speak to that from the literature. We have had a situation where both the research group and the IRB, again, please turn off your mic if you're not talking, where the IRB required what was seen as an exorbitant reimbursement or payment for participation. So the balance here is within the context of a country. What is it that honors someone's time and participation, and what is too much that in fact becomes coercive? Leah, let me turn it to you. Any comments or thoughts from the literature?
Sure. Hi, Will. What we've been seeing in the literature thus far is that remuneration amounts should be minimized to the extent possible when they are given at all. But I haven't encountered in our search so far requirements from IRBs for a specific amount. I'd be very interested to hear more details about this experience, and I'm very happy to share additional findings in the literature as we continue our search.
Thanks. So a comment from Sophie that case studies would be massively useful as they give more real life view on the issues. High level policies are less useful for us for doing programming on a day-to-day level. Ikukuza says outlines a framework for child rights that has some guidance on evolving ability of children to determine their own lives. So what I hear in your comment is that under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, there are a set of at least principles, if not more direct guidance. And that may be a framework for thinking about some of these issues. One of the suggestions that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on was really to have a platform where people could share issues that they're facing, cases that they're seeing, and really allowing for real-time discussion with colleagues. Does anyone on this conversation have experience with that kind of platform and would want built around some of these ethical issues be of value? A moderated discussion platform. At least a few people see that this could be helpful. Let's go on. If you could pose the next question. Yes, the presentation, this is going to be posted online. It will be available. There's concern about sharing with outside organizations. So I think the question there becomes one of whether it can be done in a relatively anonymous kind of way. Yeah, finding solutions is difficult. And I think part of the issue, Anna, is that there may be no concrete solutions for some of these issues. But really, I think that what the best might be is to hear 2 or 3 perspectives around a given issue that might open some other options or opportunities of how to think about dealing with a particular situation. Case studies, again, people might find useful. A chat room. Every context is different, Sophie. I think you're right. That said, I think there are some cross-cutting principles, but to hear how this is done from multiple perspectives might be useful. From Prernia, we dealt with young adolescent girls who had eloped and parents had negated their agency by bringing them back from their hideouts with their partner of choice. And it's difficult to trust parents as the guardians protecting the interest of such girls. And I think what you're really talking about here, and this has broader implications than just the case that you're talking about, is where family interests and priorities, such as honor or respect, may come into conflict with an individual young person's desire or wishes. Leah, let me ask you, in the literature, did you see anything related to that kind of tension?
I think where that arose mostly was within sort of the broader theme of adolescent dissent from protocol. So studies where they had prescribed that parents would be contacted in the case of, for example, issues of reports of abuse or harm, but that the adolescent's wish might differ. And I don't think there was a consensus within the literature of how to handle that. It seemed that most researchers address those issues on a case-by-case basis. So I don't think there was a consensus per se, but it was an issue that came up repeatedly.
Thanks. Anna raises a question about IRBs. And this is certainly something that we're hearing in this survey as well. I think it would be helpful to have examples and guidance on alternate ways of consent in case asking parents, guardians are not feasible. And I think this is a topic and an issue that really needs to be thought through is for different processes. John Santilli offered a resource from UNICEF, and we'll be posting these comments as well, so everyone can have access to them and to the resources. And we'll be making the references from Leah's background work available. It'd be useful Bleckig says to hear ideas on how to address issues in encouraging and ensuring reporting on adverse events and ethical issues to the IRB. The IRB need to do to demonstrate teams that they have the resources available to support. So this really is, I think, a tension that you raise. I don't think that IRBs see their role as doing anything to help address or ameliorate the situation. I think they see their role is monitoring and assurance that something is being done. But for those of us in the field, that kind of monitoring and reporting feels very insufficient when faced with some of these issues. And I think the point that you make is a terrifically good one of needing to engage IRBs in a much more proactive kind of way. And you're absolutely correct. Ikuza, that there are a set of references, and we will be compiling these, both from the literature, from international organizations, that come at this from a variety of different perspectives. But at least from what we have seen, there are significant gaps as well in that literature. So the observation from Malawi is that perhaps ethics committees may not pay so much attention to WHO guidance as seen not the core mandate of WHO, but might be more attentive to ethics mandated bodies such as CIOMS. And I think that there are an increasing number of groups focusing on ethical issues. The European Union has a working group on this very topic. And I think the point, Sunil, that you are making is also very spot on, that the IRB's framework is often legal, and the consenting is within a legal framework. And Rebecca makes also a very good point in terms of the Global Alliance to End Childhood Violence. And next slide, or the next bullet point. One last question that I would raise. Given the potential two conflicting ethical principles in research, that of autonomy, respecting an individual's rights, and beneficence, doing no harm, and in the case of children and adolescents fall within that legal category, according to UN rights of the child, you want to protect them from harm, not only do no harm. How do you think IRB should resolve these dilemmas? Or is it the role of the IRB? Is the IRB's role really monitoring and legal, and it is our responsibility as a researcher or as a service provider or program person to deal with these issues? Where does core responsibility here lie in dealing with these kinds of issues? We'll just wait a few seconds for people to have a chance to share their perspectives on this. Because I think that we can look to external bodies for guidance. I think we have somewhere to draw a line in understanding legal laws of consent and enabling rights of consent. Both in sync or synergy is really important. Another ethical issue is the space in which interviews are conducted, where the child might not be able to speak the truth. I think this is a very important point that you raise. How to defend the things said in confidentiality, as well as said with gestures or non-verbally. You raise a really, really interesting point, because how to capture a look or an expression and to understand that, we tend to focus pretty exclusively on what is verbally said, but we know a lot of communication is nonverbal. Do no harm is a big priority, but perhaps not doing anything creates more harm. Very interesting perspective on this. Ultimately, core responsibility must lie with program staff and researchers. The IRB governs and guides. The fact that they are not in the field makes it difficult to ensure beneficence. Yeah, spot on. If the responsibility of both researcher and IRB to safeguard the respondent, I feel like there's more of a role for the IRB to provide guidance rather than practical support. They should provide overarching guidance and should make an assessment based on your proposal. Reina says, I think it is a shared responsibility, IRB to monitor and can exercise authority to ensure researchers have developed connections with existing resources to address such issues. Thank you for raising that, because I think this is our one of our core responsibilities, is to assure that we, doing the research, have made contact with those who would be available to help. Anna notes in the meaning of doing no harm, for example, if parents are perpetrators of abuse in relation to parental consent. IRB has a huge responsibility, but I agree that researchers and programs can't be free because IRB gave approval rather than the opposite. Caroline Kabira says that both are responsible, that they need really to be in sync. The IRB should ensure inclusivity and the rights of adolescents to participate. Gertrude from Blantyre notes some training tools for IRBs would be useful so that committees can be oriented on these nuances so they just don't say no. I think your point is a very good one, Gertrude, because what our experience for decades has been that one of the reasons why there has been so little research with young adolescents is because researchers have been afraid that IRBs would simply block it. And in truth, IRBs have blocked research with young adolescents because they simply haven't had a sense of how to deal with this. And I think the point also that Yarrow raises is that vulnerable populations can't be excluded. And there is a very strong tendency to exclude them by IRBs because and by researchers, because we're afraid of dealing with some of these kinds of complexities. So as to have more guidance could be very beneficial. I see that we are very close to the end of the hour. This has been, at least to my ears, a very rich conversation. I would greatly encourage that it be continued. We see this as an ongoing dialogue. Miranda notes the learning from this survey and from the GEAS ethics groups could be useful for the development of practical training material for field researchers using some of these cases. And that's really our hope, Miranda, that as we move forward on this. Let me turn it to Leah. Final comments or thoughts that you would want to make at this point.
I just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this work and to involving you all in this process and in the findings that we generate. Thanks again.
We will be back in touch. Thank you, Leah, for your work, for Quinn, for helping to make this all happen. And we really appreciate your participation, everyone who has been on this conversation. Have a good remainder of the day and the week and the month. Take care. Bye now.